107 days. That's how long the Supreme Court took to decide the Trump tariff cases. The timing tells a story, and the data explains why. I'm Ryan Weir, and this is the High Court Report.
This is the High Court Report with special guest, Dr. Adam Feldman.
Today, we examine one of this term's most consequential rulings, the Trump tariff cases. The court deliberated for 107 days before ruling. We'll unpack the high-level takeaways, why it took as long as it did, and how the votes broke down, all through the lens of data that tracks 25 years of Supreme Court timing patterns. Dr. Adam Feldman joins the podcast today to help us sift through the numbers. He's the person who tracks this data and more. Dr. Feldman created and writes the blog Empirical SCOTUS and the Substacks page called Legalytics. Dr. Feldman serves as the statistics editor for SCOTUSblog. He also runs the legal analytics and AI consulting firm called Empirilaw and teaches a political science course at the collegiate level. Dr. Feldman earned his law degree at UC Berkeley and practiced as a trial lawyer for several years. Afterwards, he completed a Ph.D. in political science at USC and followed that up with a post-doctoral fellowship at Columbia Law School. He's authored 15 articles in law and peer-reviewed journals. Thanks so much for joining, Dr. Feldman. How are you doing today?
Great. Glad to be here. Good day to talk about the Supreme Court.
Yes. Now, Adam, a lot happened today. As we just mentioned, Trump tariff cases came out in 60 seconds. What most stands out to you from the Trump tariff cases decision?
Well, I think it starts with timing. There has been a lot of speculation about when this opinion was going to drop. And it took longer than some people thought. But now that we see what actually came out of it, I think a lot of it makes sense. You have 170 odd PDF pages that are factored into the decision. You have a majority opinion and then 6 separate opinions. You have a lot of different voices that are explaining different views on this. You have 3 dissenting justices. You have a majority of 6 justices, but they're kind of split on different issues in the case. And so the complexity is a key part of this, but also the doctrinal development. I think the justices were really wrestling with what the major questions doctrine means. And this is somewhat of a modern doctrine. And so watching this development was key, but clearly seeing the justices interact with each other through their opinions and also being able to kind of see how the tea leaves played out. Exciting for me that to see that the ways that the justices talked about the case in oral argument and the way that their prior votes have indicated really did lead as a good predictor to how they would position themselves on the merits in this decision.
Speaking of predictions, when you and I spoke in our pre-production call, you mentioned that the Trump tariff cases were going to come out soon. So hats off to you. What within the data you looked at made you lead to believe that the decision was coming down the pipe?
Well, there are indicators from the past that are obviously helpful. I stay on top of the data and how long it takes opinions to come out after they're orally argued. And, the tariff case is somewhat of an anomaly because it's one of those few cases that on the docket, the justices actually said this was going to be an expedited decision. This was added quickly to the oral arguments docket. It was argued quickly. And then the expectation was this was going to be decided in a number of weeks and not months. It actually took longer than that, longer than several of the expedited cases in the past, which happens very seldomly. But for a 170-page decision, that clearly explains why it took longer than some people expected, though it was actually probably significantly shorter in time than this would have been if this was not on an expedited basis, but rather a normally oral argued case, which almost definitely would have dropped in June rather than in February.
You mentioned the breakdown of the different justices' writings in this opinion, and by my count, 7 of the 9 justices wrote opinions. So what does that tell you about the timing and how that stacks up over the past 25 years of data?
The number of separate opinions is correlated very strongly with the amount of time it takes for a decision to be released, and there are a couple good reasons for that. There's a lot of discussion that goes along behind closed doors. Now, this isn't always discussion, face to face. Sometimes they're communications by email. They used to be written notes that they would share with each other. So this is a practice from that's gone on for a long time. But that really tends to lengthen out the amount of time it takes to come to a decision, and that's because the justices initially vote how they think they're going to decide right after the oral arguments or the Friday after. But that helps set who is going to write the majority opinion and who might write a dissent. Now, common practice is for when the Chief Justice is in the majority, he or she gets to assign the majority opinion author. And it was, likely that Roberts would assign it to himself. So that was one thing that I noted in advance. But just going back to the amount of time it takes, once the draft decisions are written, there are opportunities for the justices to switch votes or to do rewrites. And so this isn't just a one-stop shop, but it's really iterative. And my guess is that there were several drafts that were gone through, maybe votes that sort of shifted. People might decide to write a concurrence that were in the majority because they don't totally agree with the language. And so the fact that there are so many separate opinions, I think, really counts, and the length of the decision in its entirety account for the amount of time it took for them to actually release this opinion after argument.
Now, Adam, you recently wrote a comprehensive Substacks Legalytics piece on the timing of Supreme Court decisions. It's called The Supreme Court's Vanishing Fall Docket: How Decision Timing Has Transformed Since 2000. It's a must read. As soon as I read the article, I really wanted to have you on to talk about it. And that was originally the focus of today's episode before we got the breaking news from the Trump tariff cases. So, your article draws on more than 1,700 argued cases spanning from 2000 through 2025. Walk us through how you built the data set, what patterns jumped out at you immediately, and which patterns only started to take shape after you assembled the full picture.
Yeah, so there's great data on the Supreme Court, so I don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, which makes my life easier when I'm writing about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court database, which was originally developed through Michigan State, Harold Spaeth, and was picked up by Lee Epstein at WashU St. Louis, and has now been kind of navigated through different universities, has comprehensive data of each Supreme Court decision really since the establishment of the Supreme Court, and the first decisions rendered in the 1790s. So it allows me to track things like the amount of time it takes between oral arguments and decisions with specificity and without having to gather a lot of data aside from updates. So they don't have data until a term completes. And so I looked at the data for this term so far. There haven't been a ton of decisions, but there are some interesting decision points to compare to past terms. But there is off-the-shelf data, and I'm a connoisseur of that. I helped develop that also when I was a Ph.D. student, and so I'm intimately familiar with it, and I try to leverage it whenever I can in my articles.
And so what were some of the patterns that emerged? What did the data show you?
So there's been some interesting changes over time, and some of it has to do with the shift to decisions in June. So if we look, earlier in this article, so like earlier in time in the article, so closer to 2000, and even before the time that the article, the timeline of the article, so prior to 2000, there were many more decisions that were rendered in the early months of a calendar year. So each Supreme Court term starts at the beginning of October. That's when the first arguments are had, and then decisions can come out anytime after that. And historically, you had decisions in November, December, January. More recently, that has become very seldom practiced. So now you have 50% or more of the decisions coming out in June, which is the last month typically for the court's decision. So they really are backloading the docket, and I think that's a very interesting development. It kind of dovetails with the shadow docket and the uptake on emergency applications that have been filed. And so I think that there is some relationship between the Supreme Court justices handling business extraneous to the merits docket and probably slowing down the decision making. And so there's definitely, both elongated time between oral arguments and decisions that relates to decisions coming out more often in June. Those tend to be the weightier decisions, especially the ones that take the longest period of time. But there's also some relationships between those in the tariff case in terms of ones that tend to be lengthier, have more separate opinions.
So, Adam, let's spin things forward to this term. The court decided, by my count, 8 out of 61 unique cases. And by unique, I mean, I'm just counting the consolidated cases once. So, for example, the Trump tariff cases, the court actually decided 2 cases, but I'm counting them as one unique case. The justices, prior to today, the justices released exactly their opinions 1 month ago. And so far, by my tally, I have 5 9-0 cases, 1 7-2 case, 1 6-3 case, and 1 5-4 case. About 48 cases remain undecided. What does your research say about when and how the rest of the cases will shake out?
So this is a major uptick compared to the last several years. Really, since COVID, the Supreme Court slowed down quite a bit during COVID and hasn't picked back up until this year in terms of the speed of decision making. So the number of decisions we've seen so far this term is more than at this point in prior terms, definitely accelerated. Also, the fact that we saw a 5-4 this early in the term is significant for a few reasons. One is those 5-4 decisions tend to take longer to come out for the same reason that the expectation that the tariff case took a long time had to do with the separate opinions and the disagreements of the justices. So what that tells me in the Beau case, which is a criminal case, that the justices didn't switch around very much from their initial positions. But it definitely is an anomaly to see a 5-4 decision that early in the term. The rest of them, the mainly unanimous decisions, are what we would expect to come out early in the term. They tend to be the ones that are easiest to resolve, where there aren't a lot of discrepancies, where the black letter law is the clearest, and so they tend to be decided the earliest. Although this term is earlier than we've seen these types of decisions made in the last several terms. So they did pick up the pace a little bit. There's probably some strategy to that. Maybe not wanting to have to force as much out at the end of the term as they've had in previous terms. So, it's clear that there's some kind of readjustment they're making, and they're constantly adjusting to the number of cases on the shadow docket. There had to be a major readjustment under Trump because the administration now is just pushing so many emergency applications towards the court in ways that we haven't seen administrations, including under Trump 1, do in the past. So the justices are doing this on the fly, but the kind of top level point here is that they are moving quicker this term than they have in the last several.
Okay. Final question. I'll get you out of here on this. So this term's early decision rebound, is this a course correction or a 1-year anomaly?
It's a tough one. It's hard to project where that's going to play out down the road. I would say that it is probably somewhere in between. I think they do want to get more decisions out early in the term, so they're maybe not as backloaded. But the upside to backloading is that they have more time to decide these things. So really, at the end of the day, they could decide everything in June, and that's one way to have more time for everything. But from a probably psychological standpoint, that's a lot to have on your plate in the last several weeks of the Supreme Court term. So I do think they want to probably have more decisions that are made in the December, January, February months. I think that's tricky with the shadow docket and having to decide some of those cases early in the term that are kind of holdovers from the summer. And some of them are going to be accelerated grants to cert. like with tariffs, right? There are emergency applications, and then sometimes those turn into granted cases that are argued. Trump versus CASA, which was decided last term, is a great example of that, where it was an emergency application that was shifted to a granted case, ended up being probably the most consequential decision of last term. And that's, without the birthright citizenship question that was part of that case, which is going to be argued in the Trump versus Barbara case later this term. I think that there probably is some kind of correction that they're trying to make. But if that will actually lead to something substantive that is meaningful, I think is an open-ended question and really is more situational than something that we can read far in advance.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for walking us through the data. Your insights are invaluable, and I'm so glad that you were able to come on for a few minutes and break some of this information down. Quick question for you. Where can listeners find your work?
I'm, a man of many hats. So you can find me on Legalytics. You can find me on Empirical SCOTUS. You can find me on SCOTUSblog. I'm occasionally on Twitter. The handle is at Adam S. Feldman. You can find me on LinkedIn. I try to be more prolific on LinkedIn. So look for me there. That's about it.
Great. I'll link to your social media handles in the show notes, along with the Vanishing Dockets article and your prediction article, the Trump tariff cases prediction article. I'll link all of that in the show notes so people can find you. Again, we really appreciate your time today. For those that are listening, if you found this helpful, please share, rate, follow, subscribe to the High Court Report wherever you get your podcasts. And please share this episode with anyone you know who follows the Supreme Court or who cares about the institution that operates the third branch of government. Thanks again for your time, and we'll talk to you again soon.